Hey, good morning and welcome to Church 180. Glad to have you with us. I say good morning, maybe it's a different time of day when you're joining us, but we're glad to have you with us. On this Sunday after Easter, we're talking this morning about the impact of the resurrection. What does it mean to us to get to know the risen Lord and the various ways he comes and meets us? So we pray that this will be a blessed experience for you this morning. We're really glad to have you with us. So we're looking at John chapter 20. If you want to turn in your scripture there this morning, you know, we think of Jesus and all of the events that lead up to Easter, and we celebrate that. And as I've mentioned before, in our culture, I think we are very results-oriented many times, and we lead up to, we work up to, we get excited about, then we have the big event, and then we move on to something else. You know? Mm-hmm. But in this particular instance, many instances really in our faith, but in this one in particular, it's critical that we understand that Easter's not the end, it's the beginning. Now we talk about Christmas being the beginning, and people are a little bit maybe more inclined to see the birth of a child as the beginning, even though Christmas also we celebrate as an end, and then we look to New Year's. But for Easter, well, that's really a holiday that we internally, inside the family, celebrate. But for us, not only is it a beginning, it changes everything. So I want to ask you this morning as we think about what changes it's brought about, the event itself, what God was doing at Easter, how that's impacted you. I'd like you to think back about how you came to the Lord in the first place, what that looked like, how he met you. And we're going to look at some of those stories this morning because the writer of the Gospel of John found it very important to him personally, to speak to his audience, whoever's reading the Gospel, about why Jesus came, the impact that he had, and particularly so that we readers, we believers, we followers of Jesus might actually enter into the life that he came to give us. You find that at the end of chapter 20, and that's where I want to start. One of those that I'm going to start at the back and work toward the front. You know how we do that sometimes? John's Gospel, chapter 20, in verses 30 and 31. John writes this: Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Obviously, he's referring to a lot of signs that are recorded in this book. But he's indicating that there are many others, so there must be a reason why he chose the ones that he did to include. But these are written, these that John has chosen in particular, are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Let me read that last phrase again, because I want to focus on that. If I can paraphrase the first part, I've recorded these signs. I've explained to you these events. That by believing, you may have life in his name. That's really the focus of Easter, isn't it? It's what God has done to give us life. So I want to ask you, how did you come to life? How did you come to life? Now I'm making an assumption, right? That you have come to life. And I don't say that, although I smile, I don't say that entirely joking. I mean that sincerely. Because I believe from my own life, maybe I should say from my own experience, that it's possible to come to Jesus. It's possible to have a degree of belief that he is an important person, that he is one to be revered, but not necessarily that you enter into the life he's come to give us. Are you tracking with me? Does this have some resonance in your life? I think like in mine, for example, and I'm going to come back to the question, but I hit you with it right off the bat and I didn't expect you to answer. But I do want us to come back and actually discuss, if you're willing, what that looked like in your life. In my life, I grew up in a family that worshiped the Lord. I don't really remember a time in my life in not knowing about Jesus. We went to church, we prayed at home, we read the Bible from time to time, we went to events that were Christian-oriented. So I don't really remember ever there being a time in my whole life where Jesus wasn't a part of it. But he wasn't necessarily all of it. And my life radically changed when I began to understand who he really is from a personal encounter, a personal experience. Right? Again, I don't know if this resonates with you or not, but it's of critical importance. Now, if you back up just a bit, you see 4 stories, 4 accounts, if you will, in this chapter that John is reminding us or introducing us to some of Jesus' early disciples and what took place when Jesus met them after the resurrection. Now, the gospel is full, as are the other gospels, of lots of stories and descriptions of what it looked like for Jesus to begin to teach those first disciples and all the rearranging of their mental furniture that had to happen as they began to grasp what we've known is being turned upside down. Much of it was difficult to grasp. Some of it was good news. Some of it was hopeful news, turned out not to be what Jesus had in mind. But all of it was challenging, bewildering, some of it comforting. None of it left totally out of the way life would be from that point on. And then he's killed. You build up and you build up and you build up over 3 years' time of intense experience together, and he's killed. Grasping that was a massive challenge for them. And we pick the story up where he begins to come to them after God had raised him from the dead. Peter and John were the first ones in the first story that John captures in chapter 20, where they hear and they run to the tomb to find out, has he really risen? Is he not there? And it says that Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in and saw the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb, and he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who reached the tomb also went inside. He saw and believed. You might say in this instance that belief came from the evidence. There's no appearance of Jesus in this first story, but there's evidence that he's no longer there. In the second story, he actually does encounter Mary Magdalene in person, even though she doesn't know him, right? And in that encounter, that recognition doesn't occur until he speaks her name. And then she grasps. And I use that word in particular because while she says, "Teacher," once he speaks her name, there's a desire to hold on to him, to cling to him, some translations say. Why would that be? Why would you want to cling to him? When he's had an impact in your life like he had in Mary Magdalene's life, losing him was almost more than she could take. And she doesn't want to lose him again. It's that personal, up-close encounter that she values so much. Then on the evening of that first day, John says, Jesus shows up and enters into the presence of the other disciples. And it's a passing through the door or the walls. He just appears with them. Again, it's a personal encounter. And in that encounter, he says, peace be with you. Because he recognizes that when we encounter the divine, when we encounter God, when we encounter someone who we know is dead, I've either bored you to tears or there was a rough night last night. Have you encountered somebody who was dead and is alive again?
Only one.
I was going to say, that's a trick question. That's a trick question.
Not in the last week or two.
Not in the last week or two. Imagine. Close family member, a close friend, you've known them well. You know for a fact they died. And then you encounter them. I'd need to hear peace be with you. I might need to hear a little bit more than that. If I stood around long enough to hear. Right? And after he says, peace be with you, he breathes on them. He breathes on them the breath of life. Receive the Holy Spirit, Jesus said. Imagine what those disciples were grappling with. And finally, we reach the story, the last of the four stories, where there's Thomas. Those of us who have been in church for a long time might know him from Sunday school era, way back when. The stories of doubting Thomas, right? But Thomas represents an important part of our journey. If he's dead and he's alive again, so you tell me, I got to have a lot more than just that, no offense. Thomas is the same way. He'd sold out. He had sold out his life for Jesus. And Jesus is taken away. I need to see proof. All due respect. And Jesus meets him. And you know the rest of the story, he holds out his hands. So in these four stories, you have evidence. Evidence that the body's no longer in the tomb. You have evidence in relationship. Even though I don't recognize this person talking to me, they know me by name and they speak it, and I know instantly. Because that relational contact and importance is real. You have the physical presence among you, a group of you, and he challenges you. But he also changes the way your life has been through the existence of it. And finally, he meets you in that place of doubt and gives you firsthand evidence that he's present in your life. So I give you those four stories to illustrate not only what the Gospel of John, the writer, was trying to tell anybody that would read, but to come back to my question, how did the Lord meet you when you finally recognized who he is? Can you grasp that time in your life? Do you remember the circumstances? And then the big question, the risky question. It's dangerous to walk in here. Would you be willing to share it?
For those in this group, they know that I'm somewhat of a detail-oriented person. Anal retentive perfectionist might be a phrase somebody might use. I met him in the details. I had abandoned God as a youth
Okay.
for lots of reasons, and I won't go into the
Particulars.
of all of that. And ended up in a church that was targeted towards reaching people that didn't believe.
Sure.
And through the messages of the teachers in that church, and then through sitting in smaller groups and having some evidence presented, I finally came to the realization that it would take more evidence to believe God doesn't exist, to believe Jesus didn't come in human form, die, and rise again,
Yeah.
than to believe that he did.
The evidence seemed overwhelming.
It was overwhelming in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. And that certainly describes a lot of people's first encounter, so to speak, through the evidence. Anybody else willing to share?
Mine was a little bit different. I had always known about Sunday school,
Sure.
early church and stuff, but I had stopped going in high school. Or was it junior? I don't remember. We're talking 60 years ago. Louder? So through a set of circumstances, Jim and I started going to this church, and I pretty much came the same process of the teachings and witnessing and watching people. I mean, the one thing that sticks out in my mind is the young man who sang a song that first Sunday. And you could see his face up on the screens. And the look in his eyes and the expression on his face, he really believed what he was singing. And I thought, I think I want some of that.
Yeah.
So that kind of opened the door, and I started paying attention. And finally came to the realization that Christ did die just for me. Not as his wife or the kids' mom or none of that, just for me. And how could I not accept that gift? How could I not? And that just started a whole new way of thinking. And I honestly don't know what I would be like now without him.
Sure.
And I don't want to find out.
Yeah, right.
So it's,
Right.
it's
So
just
we-
a process.
So we have evidence really in the convincing proofs. We have evidence from the encounter with someone else who obviously has met him and is living for him. Anybody have a different story? Anybody have a different encounter?
I was, like you said, I don't remember a time not knowing who Jesus was or why he was important in my family. We always went to church, we were always in Sunday school, always doing everything that way, but as a child, I watched a passion play of sorts
Okay, sure.
over Easter time,
Okay.
and I couldn't get through my head any reason why Jesus would die on a cross, except for his love for us. Because I realized he had the power to not do it, not have to do that. He allowed it to happen. He did it, and it just didn't make sense as to any other reason for me.
Sure.
And I thought if he loved me that much, then I should probably love him back.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's,
Kind of a reasoning.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, to consider all the ways God meets us? Those of you who know me know that I spent most of my growing up years relocating. And so I didn't have friends. We didn't live anywhere long enough to have friends. And when I finally had a friend, death came quickly through a drunk driver. And I found myself on my knees crying out. This guy was a great guy. He was human, but he was a really good guy. He was one of the best people I'd met up to that point in time. And for a young guy, he wasn't one of those older ones that had been in church forever that you all respect. There was something different about this guy. He seemed to get along with everybody. Didn't make any difference who you were. And for his life just to be gone, I thought, no way. It can't just happen. And God took a shy kid who was really uncomfortable in social settings. And I ended up presenting to the entire student body at a memorial service we had in our high school. It happened because of a deep penetrating need I had to believe that there couldn't just be an end. There had to be something more. And in crying out, Jesus met me in a powerful way. And that was just one of a series of personal encounters in the midst of a great need that I couldn't resolve on my own, where God met me through the risen Jesus. Now, I didn't meet him like I'm looking at you. We weren't physically in the same room, in the same bodies. But he's been in the room. And there's been zero doubt in my mind that I was in the presence of the risen Lord. So where am I headed with all of this? Well, I guess I want to ask you this morning, how has the resurrection, well, not how has it, how is it making a difference in your life? What difference does it make to you now, today? That Jesus is not only alive again and not only exalted at the right hand of God, but he has all authority. What difference does it make to you that the resurrection occurred? Is it simply a subject of some good stories? Or has it rearranged everything about your life? And I ask that question not so much for you to answer, but to say, if it hasn't, I've got great news. It can. It can totally change your experience of life here and now. Those of you who have heard me teach or preach, you know this is a vitally important part of my message. I guess every pastor or preacher, what a teacher, has certain things they grasp onto. This is one of mine. Because I see a culture in which we live, a society in which we live, where there are Christians and there are non-Christians, there are people of other faiths, and the polls increasingly tell me that a vast majority consider us as a whole people to be in trouble. We don't like the way our country is. We don't like what has happened to us as a people. And I wonder, with so many people over the last few decades, and many of whom are still around that claim Jesus as Lord, the risen Lord, the resurrected and still living, but with all power and all authority given to them, I wonder why things aren't different.
It's interesting, in my brain, there's a key. And it's in that story of Jesus appearing to his disciples. When he appeared to his disciples the first time, what's the text say? The doors were locked. You needed a key to get in. When a week later, it says, he appeared to doubting Thomas. A week later. So he'd appeared to the other disciples.
Right.
But a week later, they're in that room. Behind what? A locked door. For the second time, he needed a key to walk through. Well, he didn't need the key, but
Right.
you needed a key as a physical person. And what struck me some time ago is they're hiding behind a locked door. And they've seen the risen Christ. A week later, they're still hiding behind a locked door. And they've seen the risen Christ again. And from that point forward, they didn't hide behind locked doors ever again.
Right.
They went out.
That's right. That's one way of describing, a very true and vital way of describing the impact of meeting the risen Lord. I wonder if that's true in your lives. I don't wonder it as in a judgmental question. I don't wonder it as in, well, what's wrong with you if that hasn't occurred? I wonder in the sense of there's an opportunity for everything to change. We're going to talk more in the coming weeks about what does it mean for Jesus to be alive today, in our midst, even if we can't see him. What does it look like to be a follower of one who you can't see and put your hands on, but everything we know has been impacted by the resurrection? What does that mean? And what could it mean for whatever you're challenged with today? Whatever you wish was different today? Whatever maybe holds you or keeps you back from what you'd like to be? John wrote these and other stories that we might believe, and in believing we might have life in his name. You know, in other parts of the gospel, he speaks of life eternal, everlasting life. Friends, I hope that you walk away today wondering, is my life radically different because not only did I meet or have I met, but am I living daily with a resurrected, risen Lord of all of life? If it's not, what might I do to make it different? It starts with an encounter. I don't really know how we can come to the risen Lord and give our lives to him surrendered, truly surrendered, totally turned over, control, without encountering him. And so I want to encourage you today to consider what that might involve for you personally. And even if you've known him a long time, do you need to encounter him again? Do you need to encounter him in the same or a different way? And most importantly, do you need to respond in a particular way to that encounter?